Thanks for coming back for part 3 of my ongoing series on how I painted my Outrider bikes. This segment is primarily on how all of the detailing work was done. As the last one, we did a lot of the base coating and broad strokes and weathering, or base weathering, so now we're going on to more of the detailing. So what I did is, for the leather segments, I put them down with a base coat of the Wildwood contrast paint, because this just has good coverage and gives me a nice brown foundation to work on top of. And it doesn't really matter what color may have oversprayed onto the leather sections. The Wildwood will just go right over top of it, and it helps give me some definition on where the shadows and the brighter section should be. And then from there, I'm just going to highlight it. And to do that, I'm going to use a sponge. So similar to what I use for chipping, I'm going to take a sponge, I'm going to take a lighter shade of brown, I'm going to get it so it's very nearly dry, and then I'm going to just stamp it over, and that builds up a nice sort of textured look on the leather. Makes it look a little bit more realistic than you'd get otherwise, just using a brush. The specific browns that you use aren't really important. In fact, I use different ones each time I do it, because I like to have the leather have a little bit of variation amongst the different infantry, just kind of like you'd get in real life, where every cow is going to make a slightly different color brown, even when it's dyed. So I don't worry too much about what browns I'm using, other than the fact that as I add layers, I'm getting lighter, just to give it a little bit more depth to it and really bring out the highlights. You can see now as I'm adding the lighter tone here that I'm mostly focusing on areas that were lighter after applying the Wildwood contrast paint, and I'm trying not to get as much paint into the darker areas and the shadows, because I don't really want them to be brighter. I want them to be that darker section and to be in shadow. So I'm lightening it up, especially on the front and the front edge and in the middle there where it's a higher point, rather than just the whole thing all together. You can see here that the sponging isn't always super tidy. As a result, I ended up getting a little bit of it onto the metallic sections. Not that big a deal here. I've just wet my brush. I'm just trying to wipe it off as best I can with the water, because it hasn't fully dried yet. But the reason why I don't fully highlight everything yet until all the base colors are on is because stuff like this happens, and I don't want to have to re-highlight everything. And I often in the highlighting stage, if there are little errors like this, I can go right over top of them with the metallic. With the gun holster done, it's just now doing the little pouch that's on the back of him, or any other little leather sections that I find. That looks pretty good now that it's dry. I'm not really happy with the contrast though, so I'm taking just a little bit of black wash here and just filling in the shadows a little bit more, just to help punch up that contrast. And because the Citadel wash is transparent, I can just build it up in layers very gradually as I need to. But I'm not washing the whole thing, I'm just applying it specifically where I want it to be a little bit darker, but I still want to maintain some of the brown undertones showing through. I found that the leather is just a little bit too bright here, so I've just created a bit of a glaze here with another brown. I've just really watered it down and just applying a few coats here just to take a little bit of the edge off of the lightest color that I used on the leather, because it's a little bit brighter than I wanted it to be. And next up, we're going to add the highlights to all of the chipping and to the leading edges of everything. Now, you may wonder why this wasn't done right after the brown chipping was done. The reason why is I like to do these highlights after I've done all of the big color blocking. So after all the big green sections are done, all the big brown sections, and all the silver sections are done. And the reason being is that sometimes mistakes happen. Especially with silver, sometimes you get just a little bit of paint, beyond where you want it to be, and typically it ends up hitting an edge. And these edges are now going to have this lighter green applied to them anyways, so rather than having to worry about fixing that mistake, I just paint over it with the highlight. And it's just a quicker way to deal with any. Now, I will say that this stage is optional. It does look pretty good with just the brown chipping. The extra highlights really just add to it, and it's good for display model, but for just a general army, it's probably not necessary. And beyond that, once I add the additional weathering in the next step, you're going to notice that a lot of them end up getting hidden anyways. So if it's just going to be for a normal model, it's not for display, just go right ahead, don't even bother doing this. But if you really want it to shine, or you really want it to stand out, then adding this green highlight to the underside of all of the scratches, because the light's coming from above, and to any leading edges, it really helps make it pop. You don't want to do it onto the tops of pieces generally, unless it just sort of feels right, because there is no bottom that you can easily access. Sometimes this happens if it's on like a side or something where you can't easily highlight just below. You have to highlight up the sides. But the biggest thing here is patience, because it does take a long time. I think this took over an hour, which is why I'm going to speed through the video a whole lot shortly, so you don't have to watch it all. As I mentioned in the last section, there are two ways of doing this. The first one is that you actually you stamp in all of the lighter green, and then you hand paint in all the brown chips. My preference though, having tried both, I like to do the brown chips and the streaks and scratches in the brown, and then just add with a fine brush right in on the bottom edges here to give it that highlight. It's really important that your paint is quite thin for this, otherwise it's going to not draw out very easily. It's not going to come along and follow the line. It'll just sort of stick and run out quickly. So a fairly thin paint is important, but not so thin that you start losing the pigmentation. Continuing on with the other side now, it's done the exact same. Where the yellow strip is, I still chose to highlight it with green. You could do yellow, but I've decided that green would just work fine here as well. And here you can see the final bike body with the highlights on it. Now that the green is done, we're going to go to highlighting the silver. We've got the dark silver now. It's been covered with a wash. The wash also added a matting effect to it, so it removed a lot of the reflection. This is something I like personally with my Raptors, because they're supposed to be a very pragmatic army, so having really reflective silvers and stuff doesn't really make a lot of sense for them. But having some silver parts still is good, because compositionally it adds color separation. If this part was all just green, there'd be way too much green, and it would be really kind of boring to look at. However, I still like to add some scratches to it, so while the silver may be matte in most areas, I highlight the edges onto it to just add a little bit of shine, and with a fine brush here, I'm also adding little scratches, so just sort of straight lines. They're all directional pretty much, they're all coming sort of front to back. Painting the grips on the handles is pretty straightforward. Over the black undercoat, I just apply a dark reddish brown, and once that's dried, I just highlight the upper sections, just make sure I don't go into the grooves with a lighter reddish brown. It's really nothing too complicated. Any color will work. I choose a reddish brown just because it's going to complement the other leather, which is all brown, the chipping, which is a reddish brown, and then red is the complementary color to green, so that's why I tend to stick with a lot of reddish colors. For the chainsword, I didn't want anything to be too flashy, so it's just staying basic black, same as the bolters. I feel that's more appropriate for the Raptors chapter. I'm just doing the handle in a similar method to what I did the grips for the handlebars and for all of the leather pouches and stuff. I'm just using a few different browns. I'm highlighting it with a bluish gray color along some of the edges, the leading edges. And then the silver is going to just get some highlighting on, again, the leading edges, same as the other sections of silver. But it's really nothing too fancy. But this was the first melee weapon I've actually done for the army, so I had to figure out what colors I wanted to do it. But we ended up with basic black, match the bolters. Moving on, we're going to start adding color onto the helmet. I wanted my veterans, so all of my sergeants, to have a white looking helmet, but because my Marines are so dirty looking, I didn't actually use a pure white paint. I actually ended up using a bone color and then highlighting up to that and just using a little bit of white or very near white on the very highlights of it. This works better because it's going to end up with brownish weathering on it, and it just saves me having to make the white dirty. And having this bone color tends to have a little bit better coverage as well, without requiring as many coats to get it solid. Once the first coat is done and dry, I go over it all again with another coat of the exact same color just to get that bone a little bit more solid, because a little bit of that black undercoat is shining through in spots. Next up, I use a lighter bone color in order to highlight the helmet. In this case, I'm using White Sands, which is a color from Scale 75, but really the brand doesn't matter. The main thing is that we're using an off-white color here to add the highlights. I started off by just going around all of the upper edges and front edges with the lighter bone color just to pick them out. And then afterwards I go back and I take some of the upper surfaces entirely and add the bone color onto them, and then just sort of blend it into the front areas just to get it closer to an actual white where it would be more in the light. While most of the helmets in the army all have red eyes, any of the helmets that I've been doing that are not in use, so the ones that are on the sergeant's or the captain's hips, like in this case, I'm doing the lenses in black and then highlighting up with a little bit of gray on the inside of them. The reason being is I figure when they're in use, that's when they glow sort of a little bit of a reddish color, but when they're not in use and there's no lighting in there, they would basically look black. After I'm fairly happy with how the white is looking on the helmet, or rather the off-white, I'm going to end up adding the chipping to it so that it's in keeping with everything else. In this case, I'm not using a sponge to chip it. I'm going to do it with just a brush in order to have just a little bit more control so I don't get any of the extra areas, but also because the helmet is further from the ground, it would have less chipping on it. So I want to have a little bit finer control on where those chips go and be able to really moderate how many chips I'm putting on it more easily than with the sponge. Just like how I did the chipping for the body in the green, I'm going to now take a white paint and go around the underside of all of the chips on the helmet just to bring them out and really show where that highlighted edge would be. For the black sections of the bike, I use a bluish gray color in order to highlight them. So for all of the upper edges of the bolters, for example, they're going to be gone over with this bluish gray color rather than just a neutral gray. The bluish gray it's more interesting to look at. It's always better to have something with a little bit of color rather than something that has no color when you're doing your highlighting. To paint the video screen, I start by putting on a dark green color down over the surface of the entire screen. It takes a couple of coats in order to ensure there's a good even coverage over the entire screen with the dark green that we're going to use as the base. With the dark green dry, now I'm going to take a much lighter green and I'm going to apply it up on the corners. It takes a couple of coats in order to get the corner highlights up as bright as I want them to be. Once the corners are done, I start adding on the radar grid. So I start by just putting a horizontal line across more or less the middle of the screen. As you can see, I'm trying to get multiple passes here in order to get the intensity that I want from the green. A single pass isn't just going to be enough. After this first line is done, I put a second line parallel to it, and then again add another line parallel to that one, increasing the spacing between each one of these lines in order to create sort of a vanishing point effect where the ground is going off into the distance. Next, I add a vertical line right down the middle, but it's not running the entire screen, it's just going from that horizontal line that we've already put in. And then from there, we've created a vanishing point, and now we put in diagonal lines in order to create a depth here. In order to get a little bit more pop out of the screen, I end up mixing a little bit of white into the green that I've been using, this bright green, and I just highlight it in the middle sections here. I've been experimenting a lot on different ways that I can paint raptor flesh with this army. I figure it's okay if there's a little bit of variation across them, just like normal people. You know, we don't all have the exact same skin tone. One thing, however, that is common is that they're all going to be very pallid flesh. The raptors are a successor chapter to Raven Guard. Raven Guard are known for having white skin to almost translucent skin as they get older, as well as having black hair and black eyes. So I've been working on doing a lot of different ways of creating a pallid flesh with this army. One thing I did find is that I started off with using a more bluish tone, but I found that cold look didn't really complement the green very well. It works really well for Raven Guard with their black armor, which is often highlighted with blue tones, but for raptors in their green, I found that going more yellowy or greeny in the pale skin works a lot better. Having that warmer pale tone complements the green armor much better than a blue tone did. I base coat the skin with pale flesh from Vallejo's Nocturna line. Next, with Forest Flesh from the Nocturna line from Vallejo, we're going to build out the shadows on the skin. So as you can see here, we're going around the eyes, which would be getting a natural shadow. We go in, we want to fill in the cheekbones a bit, underneath the chin, as well as I go around all of the parts of the armor, the implants, and darken those up a little bit as well. Make sure I go right below the nose because that's going to cast a shadow, and any of the areas on the forehead that I want to get a little bit darker, so the top of the bridge of the nose, as well as right above the ridges for the eyebrows, the brow there, that's going to get a little bit of shadow as well. After the shadows are done, we go back with the pale flesh and start building up the highlights again and start to clean up some of the edges on the shadows and blend them in a little bit better. I continue with the same color and just keep building up the highlights as needed. in order to build up the intensity before I move on to the next color. With highlight skin from the Nocturnal line, I use it to end up bringing up those highlights even brighter and get them even closer to a white tone. As I mentioned before, the skin is supposed to be a very pallid to almost white skin, but we still need there to be some color in the shadows of it. So as we get to the brighter colors, to the highlights, we're going to get closer and closer to a pure white. So in this case, it's just a slightly off white with a little bit of a yellowy pinkish tone to it. We're going to use it to really bring out any of the extreme highlights, so that includes areas like the bridge of the nose, the brow, the top of the head, the chin itself, the jawline, the cheekbones, as well as the lips. I'm going to go back and create a dedicated video just to how I painted the skin, and I'm going to do a few different methods in that video. I'll make sure that it's a little bit bigger and a little bit easier to see on the screen. Lastly, I'm going to use some thinned down crimson wash, and I'm going to apply that right around where the bionics start to match with his head. I figure there's going to be a little bit of discoloration there as they're attached to his head and they're worn there for a long amount of time. And even though he's got pale skin, it's still going to discolor to a slightly reddish tone. Just like our skin does if we were to have something up against it for too long, or even implanted into it as the case may be. And again, this really starts to bring a little bit more color into it and makes it a lot more interesting to look at. Just like if you were to get a scar, the skin there is going to be a little bit discolored. We're going to do the same thing here on his head. We're going to discolor the scarring that runs up on his forehead a bit. Same way we did it around the edges of the face, we're just using that watered down crimson wash. And we do it in multiple coats so that we can control the intensity and build it up as needed and easily blend the edges out into the rest of the skin. Lastly, we're going to paint the eyes. Now, I'm not the best at painting eyes. I really use a magnifier to help me a lot and a fine brush here. But with the advantage of raptors and their eyes just being solid black, I don't really have to worry about getting the whites of the eyes. So I'm just very careful with a fine tipped brush, and I just, paint it in a couple of really thin coats with black paint. And there you go, that is the detailing and painting process of my raptors. Next up, we're going to move on to how they are weathered with washes in the next part of the video series.